Hey guys, welcome back to another video. We're in the woods today and I want to talk a little bit about one thing that I did as a computer science student that really helped me with my undergrad. I will say beforehand that this is not necessary. There's lots of people that do well in their computer science undergrad that did not do this, but I think it's very useful, especially if you don't have a lot of background in computer science, such as programming or using computers, navigating your way around a computer. I think this will be very helpful in helping you get started quickly and making the gap from high school to university a bit smaller. Okay, so let's get into it. What is this one thing that I did? So the one thing that I did is I installed and I used Linux. And I know it sounds kind of cringy, like I'm some Linux advocate and I love open source or something like that. But it's actually a really good platform for development and education. But for just the purpose of this video, I'm going to say that Linux is really good for your undergrad. I'm not saying anything else beyond that. You know, you can use whatever you want past your undergrad. All I'm saying is it's a really good tool to learn and use while you're in your undergrad. So for those of you that don't know what Linux is a open source operating system. It's mostly used in servers, supercomputers, and IoT devices. So you don't really see it as a consumer. But it's what your computer science labs will mostly have at your university. Okay, so why Linux? Well, first, let's take a look at its competitors. You have Windows and you have Mac. And then there's also BSD and Chrome OS. But BSD is very similar to Mac, and Chrome is actually just Linux. So for the most part, I'll just be covering Windows, and then I'll talk about Windows subsystem Linux and Mac, as most students coming into computer science will have a Windows background. So the first reason that I think you should learn Linux and get comfortable with it is it's what you're going to be using in class most of the time, especially when you start taking some upper year systems programming courses. Software such as Git, SVN, SSH, Bash, they're all native to Unix-like systems such as Linux, whereas Windows is not Unix-like. So you have to install additional software, usually a GUI, to interact with these tools. Say if you wanted SVN, you would have to use SVN Tortoise. If you had SSH, you would use PuTTY. If you needed Bash, you would use Cygwin, and so on. Now you could just use those tools, but I think it really detracts from the education. Sometimes you have error messages that are specific to the wrapper around the software and not the software itself. Maybe you'll get an error regarding PuTTY rather than SSH. And a lot of those errors, the professors aren't really going to be able to solve for you, especially if they aren't using a Windows system, which most of the computer science professors aren't nowadays. They'll either be using Mac or they'll be using Linux. In both cases, they have access to Unix-like tools and won't be using the GUI. On top of that, when you submit an assignment that's going to be auto-marked, it's most likely going to be ran on a Linux server at your school. And the last thing you want is you have a different version of the software on your Windows because that was the latest version, but it hasn't been updated in years, versus the server having the latest and greatest version of that software, and they aren't compatible, or the newer one produces a warning message that the old one doesn't, and all of a sudden you're losing marks on your assignment. Now there is a way to alleviate that. You could SSH into your school labs computers and test it there before handing it in, or doing the entire assignment on their school systems. But that really breaks up your workflow. You know, you're at school, you're going from building to building, you're going to be losing internet connection, or you're going to be closing your laptop lid and letting it go to sleep. And whenever you do that, you lose connection to the server. So you have to re-log in every single time, go back to what you were working on, and you just end up wasting a lot of time doing that. I think most of you will enjoy doing it on your own computer instead. Another point that kind of stems from the first one is Linux is just a really good operating system for development and education. And that's probably why the computer science labs are all running Linux. You have easy access to all the libraries and frameworks that you need. They can all be installed through a single command. You don't have to update your path or your environment variables. Everything is done automatically for you. You have easy access to the shell to do anything remotely complex. You basically just have a really good development environment out of the box. Compare that to Windows. You have the command prompt and you have the PowerShell, both of which aren't really taught in school. And they're not really used outside of Windows. So they're not very transferable. And they don't have a lot of tools. You know, when you install something, it's not going to update the path on Windows. It's not going to update your environment variables. You have to do all that manually. And students coming into first year, they're not really going to know how to do that. So the solution that they have is they provide you with an IDE. Now, I'm not saying IDEs are bad, but they kind of abstract away too many things that a student should understand when they're learning the fundamentals. And when you use an IDE, you end up with this knowledge gap. You don't really understand how your program interacts with other programs. You just understand that you run a program through a program and you get some output on this tiny box. I remember when I first started programming and I was using an IDE, and I would always wonder, you know, why does my program require another program to run? Why can't I just double click on it and it'll run just like every other program? Whereas on Linux, you know that everything is ran through the terminal. You understand that your program outputs to the terminal and doesn't create some weird window. And that's how most of the other programs interact too. And because you don't have this knowledge gap, you get the confidence to try out new things. You start building on top of your foundation. Start experimenting with the stuff that you learned in class. And this really helps when you're learning more advanced topics, like file systems. The last reason is you just learn a lot of stuff when you use a system that you're not familiar with, especially one that's not geared towards the average consumer. And I know that knowing how to use a computer and actually being good at computer science are two separate things, but rarely is a course teaching you how to use a computer. And if you don't know how to use a computer, you end up doing a lot of silly mistakes. Maybe you accidentally uploaded the wrong file, or you can't find your file anymore. I've had this happen a few times with students where they would come to me with their code and we wouldn't understand why their code wasn't working until it was later that we discovered that they were editing another copy of the starter code and they were trying to compile a different copy, and no matter what we changed, we were getting the same error. And when you have like 5 assignments due, that's the last thing you want, having to fight with your computer to get things done. So when you use Linux, you learn stuff like paths, files, shells, commands, and so on. Okay, so those are the main points I wanted to touch on. There might be some more, but you guys can let me know in the comments. Now I want to touch on Windows subsystem Linux. For those of you that don't know, Windows now has a Linux subsystem available. So basically you can do Linux stuff on Windows. And my answer to that is, why? There's not much reason for you to stick to Windows unless you're specifically developing for Windows or you have some software that only runs on Windows. But for the most part, there are alternatives on Linux that does pretty much the same thing. So I don't find any reason for you to stay on Windows. And if you have Windows specific software that you don't use daily, you can always dual boot. Dual booting is just having 2 or more operating systems on the same storage device. And it's something I've been doing for years. I'll go onto Windows every now and then to play games with my friends. But for everything else, I'll be doing it on Linux. And the other thing is Mac. Now you could use Mac. Mac is a Unix-based system, and it provides most of the tools that you're going to need in your undergrad. And if you have the money for it, go for it. I'm just providing a, I guess, cheaper alternative, but at the same time, you also learn more. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, that's it for this video. Again, this is just my opinion. It's something that I've done and I found it very useful. Leave a like if you found it useful. Maybe leave a comment. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And I'll see you guys in the next one.